Hi folks, Dragan here, writer for BIDS. I want to introduce today's episode with the haiku that I wrote. Ultramarathon. Try running it. Ain't easy. Jason is special. Our guest Jason Kasper ran marathons and ultramarathons. He has done skydiving, base jumping and he has wrote fiction. His last army assignment as a Green Beret team commander. Upon returning from his final deployment in 2016, Jason began his second career as an author with the publication of his debut novel Greatest Enemy. Hit play for the full episode and learn about our interesting guest. As always, support the Break It Down show by doing a monthly subscription and the money will go right back into the show. In addition, don't forget to support SaveTheBrave.org as we battle PTSD.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick
This
Marotta.
is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Jason Kasper, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yes, indeed. Yes, you are. It's always fun to get connected. I think Jason Piccolo connected us, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he did.
So here's what's neat about Jason Kasper. He has written, coming up on 11 books. He writes about a book every quarter, we were talking about, so every 3 months or so. That's not where he started his professional career. His first career was as a Green Beret, a long tabber, Special Forces soldier in the Army. And I thought we might just kind of start there. I know you've talked about this stuff for another podcast, but let's just cover some basic ground. What was your role on the teams? And you were a North Carolina guy. You've deployed a lot. Where have you been that was interesting?
Afghanistan, Iraq, and Kenya were my three major locations.
Cool. And then do you mind telling us what your role was on the team?
Sure, I was 18 Alpha, so the detachment commander for a Special Forces ODA.
I have noticed that there are more alphas that are out doing things where you end up on a podcast than, say, Bravos, Deltas, Charlies, that kind of thing. What do you make of that? Is that accurate? Like, are the officers, the leaders, are they just more willing to go on and do something else, or what do you think about that?
I think the officers are a lot more willing to get out of the Army because once you get on a Special Forces team, you're pretty much, that's the high watermark of your career.
Right.
And then, after that, you hit the command and staff grind, and then you're not really going out into the field with the guys. So whereas an NCO can stay on an ODA, on and off for, 10, 15 years, the officers get pretty much a 2-3 year stint.
Right.
And then you're up or out. So a lot of guys choose out, and I was one of them.
Another funny dynamic on ODA is that everybody wants to be able to outshoot the Bravo. So
everybody.
and who knows if they do or not, but how come the same thing isn't true about, making comms or medics or especially like, your guys' Fox? That's not the same competition level. Why is that?
And I think everybody loves guns. Everybody loves shooting. And it's a lot easier to wrap your head around marksmanship than it is some of those other job positions, particularly comms and intel.
Yeah. Is the intel job a full-time job on an ODA, or is that always going to be sort of a secondary duty for you guys?
You do have one specific guy who's slotted for intel, so that's the 18 Fox. He's generally an E7, so Sergeant First Class. He's had, 1 or 2 rotations on a operational detachment, and then it's kind of an intermediate position before you become a team sergeant and get upgraded to a master sergeant. So yeah, it is a fixed position, and they do a lot of work. And unlike a lot of intel specialties, what they do is really cool because they're putting together these target tactics, justifying the objectives, and then they're going out on target with their guys and slinging lead with everybody else. So yeah, that makes them kind of unique in the intel capacity.
Yeah. And then which job do you think is the hardest?
Boy, I would go with team sergeant. The medics have a lot of they've had a lot of technical skill in their recertifications, but the team sergeants are juggling a lot. And to be honest, on the officer side, it's not that hard because the guys are so good. I think it was easier being a Special Forces detachment commander than it was being an infantry platoon leader.
Yeah, how much leadership is there in that? So on my end, right, as a counterintelligence agent, when you deploy as a your teams are scattered to the wind. They're, if not directly supporting another unit, they're generally supporting another unit. So, we all have multiple bosses, and we're all trying desperately to get away from the bosses because we don't need bosses to do our job. So we're really hard to lead. You got a bunch of alphas on, and I mean alphas like alpha males on a team.
Mm-hmm.
How is that trying to corral all those guys and keep, I mean, like, in egos? I mean, these are alphas of alphas, right? How do you manage that as a leader to try to let these guys be the guys they need to be, but also, guide them in a way that makes some kind of a sense as a leader?
Yeah, so I think it's not that hard if you got the right people, and a lot of ODAs have just the right people. And in particular, I ended up with like a perfect storm of, grizzled team sergeant who'd seen it all. And then we had some young, fresh talent, some 18 X-rays who came straight into the Army and did the Special Forces pipeline, and some senior guys with a few trips under their belt. So, the egos are a big piece of it. But I think once you get everybody on the same page and you show them, particularly from the leadership level, the team leader and the team sergeant, when you show up and you're like, hey, there's no egos, just about combat effectiveness. Here's what we're going to do. Everybody gets on the same page and gets behind it. And then, the officer runs the leadership, getting things approved. And then the team sergeant makes it happen at the tactical level and translates everything in your command directives down to, action by the guys. And it's pretty well-oiled machine, or at least it was for, my experience.
Right. Yeah, this is an interesting point. And a place where we can have a pretty solid conversation. The team leader and then like the officer, right? There's two leadership positions. And it seems like a lot of times, at least from my point of view, in my experience, is that the officer is going to spend a lot of time keeping work off of the guy's back, keeping attention from the command off of their back, keeping them properly employed, where like the team sergeant is going to be the guy who's leading the guys and pushing them to go wherever they need to go. Is that a fair way to characterize that? I mean, it's definitely a unique thing, an ODA or a group of ODAs and how they're led. And, even you're not in the big army, but there's still someone that's always trying to be in your business instead of, being in their own business,
Sure. The best way I've heard it put is like, you think of it like an hourglass, right? So at the top of the hourglass, you have all of your command from company, battalion on up, everything above the team. And then at the bottom of the hourglass, you've got everything at the tactical administrative level with your team guys. And then in the middle of the hourglass, it's the team leader and the team sergeant, right? So a captain and a master sergeant. And in some cases, a warrant officer, if you're lucky. I never had one when I was deploying. So the team leader and the team sergeant, you got the captain looking up and out. You've got the team sergeant looking down and around. And then if those two have good communication, you can keep command happy, get everything authorized you need to, and get your guys out the door.
And then if you had a warrant officer, I mean, that's a lot of big brains on one team. Again, like, what's that guy's role in a team that's fully plussed up and has one?
So Special Forces warrant officers, a guy who's done, generally they are, they've done 2 to 3 different ODAs, done full team time. In many cases, been a intelligence sergeant. My old intelligence sergeant went to the warrant officer course. So they've got a tremendous amount of experience. And then it's a good deal if you just wanted to stay on a team forever, because they'll do, 5-6 years ODA time as a warrant officer. And what they really bring, in addition to experience, which is often no shortage of, but they bring a lot of team continuity, right? So they can see 2 or 3 cycles of team leaders rotating through, maybe a couple team sergeants rotating through. And they've got kind of, they handle a lot of the long range training stuff. And then if you break down into autonomous elements, you go split team or whatever, you've got, essentially a second commander that can be out in a separate location.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I wanted to spend some time doing that just because there's not a lot of time spent talking about like how a team works. And, like we might know about the roles, the Bravos, the Charlies, the Deltas, and all that kind of thing, the Echoes, but the understand, and the X-rays, let's not forget them. But to understand, especially when you're going to write a book, because your books are going to be focused in this action-based world, and get me a copy of it. It was fantastic. I loved listening to it. So we talked about like, the NCOs maybe not wanting to get off of the teams and staying, but in a way, you're kind of still in that world too, because you're writing about it.
Yeah, it's an interesting touch point. And a lot of my readers are current and former military and law enforcement. And then I've got some guys with interesting military experience that serve as like beta readers, and they can come back to me with like, the intel angle and like, this doesn't pass the giggle test, tweak that before it goes to publication. But yeah, I think one of the big advantages of having played a little bit in that community prior to becoming an author and writing in, the military thriller segment, is just the familiarity with those types of personalities and being able to get like the banter and the dark humor and the planning considerations and how everybody reacts when, things go sideways on mission. It's been pretty helpful for me writing. And it's nice because I can kind of, in the best of days writing, you kind of go into the Zen trance and you feel like you're there listening to people talk. And yeah, it's made my current profession extremely rewarding.
I like it. You do, as an author, owe it to your readers to entertain them, right? And so some of this work trying to create realism has to be sacrificed for the sake of the story. How have you reckoned with that? I mean, obviously there's elements of truth in a lot of what you're doing, but there's also got to be some fantasy, because some of these things, it's hard to tell all these stories as genuinely as you can or want to, because the story has different requirements.
Sure. So one of the ways you reconcile it, or that I do, is like, nobody wants 3 chapters of mission planning and in-depth course of action briefs and everything prior to them getting out of the target. So typically for an author, you want to start, midstream. You open a scene and something's happening there in the action, and then you start filling in the exposition of where they're at, why they're there. And then as you get deeper into a book, it becomes, bringing together these different disparate elements that you've been interspersing in a series of setups, in the opening chapters or in the open first half of a book, and then bringing those together to kind of a climactic confrontation at the end. So most of what I trim, my editor ends up knocking out some of the technical stuff. Sometimes I go overboard in the technical details, and I write with confidence, knowing my editor will come back and be like, hey, we don't need these 500 words about, hitting terminal velocity on a free fall jump. So some of that gets trimmed down, and then it just becomes a matter of like what a soft team would spend, a week or two planning and doing mission packets and everything to go out on target. That'll be summed up in a few lines of dialogue. Hollywood's extreme about it. Hollywood does, like, they're walking to the birds with their parachutes on, finding what their target is. I don't take it that far, because at some point it becomes absurd. But yeah, generally I filter a lot of those details for the preparation parts of it down to dialogue between the guys as they're getting ready to roll out. And then things generally go wrong anyway, because it's a thriller.
Yeah. The characters too, though. I mean, like you have to combine characters. Certain characters have to play a role. Like when I was listening to the book, and again, everybody should get it. I'll put a link up here about the most recent book. When my biggest pet peeve, and I usually row when I'm reading books, and so I'm doing my stationary row and get my work on and everything. And every time your intel guy shows up, I'm like, God damn it, you got to toughen this guy up a little bit. He's such a I mean, look, to anybody else, he's a badass, but on this team, he's never a badass. But he's so critical to it. I was just like, man, we got to get you a slightly harder intel guy who goes out and does things, on par. Because I mean, I've seen guys like that, and so that's my pet peeve right there.
Yeah, well, thanks for your candor. Take solace in the fact that character Ian shines a little bit more in the second book. He kind of comes into his own as a gangster later in the series. So
good. It's just, it's often that the intel person often gets kind of, treated that way. Plenty of times they don't. Jason Bourne is sort of an intel guy / assassin. Mm-hmm. He's a badass, but I was like, damn it, these guys. And you're right. That is a badass. There's some badass in him. It's just, he's got to prove himself to the team. I can appreciate that. When you look at these teams, so my friend Kat Connor has written a lot of crime novels. She focused on an FBI team that went around and did counterterror and that kind of thing. And she really felt like she knew the people in her stories, like they were her friends. And when they died, she doesn't know that this is going to happen. She sort of like channels the book, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And she would grieve for her friends. She heard music. She knew these people. Do you feel it's the same way with the guys on this team or any of your other series of books?
Yeah, there's an element of personal knowledge that kind of, for me, when I do, you do the research, you do the plotting, and then I just kind of hit this point of saturation with the plotting piece where suddenly you can just hear people talking. Like you can hear the conversations, you hear the characters talking, and then it becomes kind of a rush to write down, what they're saying. But yeah, in the best of times, it's like sitting in a room with these people or being out in the desert with them and hearing and seeing everything go on, which is pretty fun. I always see everything, picture everything visually. So yeah, and like on the great writing days, it's like watching a movie play out in your head and you're just trying to keep up on the keyboard.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And the conversations are so lively on a team. Like there's a lot of jocularity, and that stuff is quick. The guys are, doing whatever it is they're doing, whether they're talking about something professional or something funny. And I can imagine that you're just, all you can do is just crank this stuff out. How much of this stuff is the dialogue is from your own experience? Like how much of that are you drawing from experience? Like, I remember when Kramer said this hilarious thing, let me slide that in here. How much reality is there?
I don't have, especially in this book, maybe in some of my really early stuff, I might have had a few specific lines from a guy, but this book and all my later stuff it's purely organic to this characters. But I think that level of authenticity, like we were saying with the gallows humor and everything else, is very much grounded in like, I just look at it as like, how would these people talk in this situation? And it's just like the same, if it was any MARSOC dude or any Green Beret or any Ranger, there's that certain level of back and forth and dark humor that I think is pretty easy to inject once you've met enough people like that.
Oftentimes the conversations on a team is quite like, it's not PC, right? It's almost the opposite. It's vulgar and offensive and everything else, but that's also true to what it is. I mean, that's what these guys are like. That's how they blow off steam. So how much of that do you put in, and do you worry about, like, we're so damn precious and we're so sensitive these days. Like if you made actual dialogue, it wouldn't work for the masses because they're not, the gallows humor works because you're there. If you're not there, you have to like lighten up on the, lighten up on the offensiveness. But that's why I'm asking, like, how do you sort that out?
Yeah, I do filter out, a lot of things that would come to play. Sometimes my editor catches something. Generally, I do it myself. But yeah, in the military, I think, it's tight knit enough. You're with people of all races, religions, and colors. And for, SF and special forces, you're working with partisan forces who are of all different colors, races, religious backgrounds. And, in the military element, like you've got all these guys willing to take a book or take a bullet for each other, right? So nobody's getting like offended. There is a lot of like super offensive humor, and it's all banter, it's all back and forth. Nobody's offended. I don't write it as blunt as it would be in that environment, simply because 90% of readers have never been in the military or law enforcement, and they will just be so distracted, even if they're not offended personally. Like anything that pulls the reader out of the story and causes them to like stop and react to what they're reading rather than going along with the flow of it and experiencing the emotion and going down, your turning points as you plotted them out, is a bad thing for an author. So I try not to put that in. What I do, I stay with profanity, right? And I have another series, like a heist series, where I specifically wrote it. There's no profanity. And that's with Team of Thieves. It's completely fictional. But for, these settings where you got a book's more or less about people getting shot in the face, right? And guys going out and getting in gunfights. It would be so inauthentic to write that without profanity. And I do eat a lot of 1-star reviews for profanity. And I get reader correspondence, listing, well, I found this so distracting and it's too many F words by chapter 7. So I put it down. And I'd be like, you probably shouldn't read books about people getting shot in the face. Just a tip. If you're that precious about it, just don't read books about, why would you want, I get if you want to read violent books. I love violent books, love violent movies. And I get if you don't want to hear profanity, but I don't understand the person who wants to vicariously experience gruesome violence, in survival situations, and then gets offended about the profanity. And, I recently had a reader come back to me. He's like, well, these 3 authors have plenty of shoot them in the face, no profanity. And I was like, none of them have ever been in a gunfight, man. Like, look at the bio of who you're reading. And if they have any police or military background, you probably don't want to read their book. So stick with authors who have no like personal experience in their subject matter. Not that that's a bad thing. Tom Clancy never served and he invented the genre. But yeah, that's one thing I'm kind of emphatic about, and I just go into every book release knowing that by day 3, there's going to be a handful of 1-star reviews of people that got upset at the 4-letter words. So
That's good though. I mean, that means you're communicating with the audience, right? Like, if you're not getting any 1-star reviews, then you're not hitting hard enough. I think you're right. You can't be as raw as we all are when we're deployed. I mean, there's just conversations that are just not appropriate for the printed word and for all of humanity to see.
This is true.
But 2 hours before that, or 2 hours from that conversation, someone might be dead, and who knows who that someone is. There's a lot of stress, and you've got to offload that somewhere. And a lot of times it's just, dehumanizing each other or dehumanizing the enemy or whatever it is, right? There's a lot of stuff to offload. And that's what struck me. I mean, obviously your book is very genuine and everything, but you're right. It's the balancing of that thing is important. And if you can't handle some swear words, well then, read a different book.
Yeah.
Your antagonists. It's the world is so look, and I'm talking to like the SF guy more right now than I am talking to the author. Mm-hmm. Like if you go to Uganda or somewhere, the lives that they lead are so hard and so different than ours. It's easy for us to come in and see them as something less than human ourselves, right? When we go there and try to help, I don't know, Afghan folks who've known nothing but war and conflict and pain.
Sure.
But if we put ourselves in their shoes, and again, this is what I'm talking to the SF guy and you, we understand that there's room to work there, but we have to start with more understanding and more, I don't know, compassion, I guess I would say. If we can't see their point, and in this case, you've got this Uyghur antagonist, and I don't want to give the book away, but here's someone that we're trying to understand a motivation, because so many of these times, these stories are like, why would they want to do this? Like, what is the point? But I need to care enough about that antagonist so that I can feel the pain, like that sort of that balance between their insanity and clearly the operation team. They have some insanity of their own.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I kind of take seriously. So in this book, the antagonist is kind of like the shark in Jaws, right? He's in the background. You get a few touch points to see, like, very intelligent. He's very driven, and you do get a little bit of backstory into the motivations. I've written other books where I go very heavily into the antagonist, and I try to come from the angle of treating these people with respect, right? I want to love every character I have, and I look at it as like, what would you do in that situation? And especially like you talk about Afghanistan, it's easy to judge them and roll everything up under 9/11 and not be able to empathize with these people. But if you were, that's the most desolate place on earth that I've been, and there's only a handful of contenders where anybody could even argue. So if you grow up in this atmosphere, there's zero opportunities, abject poverty. And then you just struggle to make a living to survive. I think there have been times where you're on the objective and there's just anybody with an AK is like, hey, here's something to do. Here's a cause to do. And honestly, if I were a dirt farmer in Afghanistan, it wouldn't take much to motivate me. Like, okay, here's a bunch of people who look different than me, dressed up like RoboCop, invading, talking about some event I have nothing to do with. I can understand that drive to pick up a rifle and run to the sound of the gun. So yeah, I think that the empathy is important. And then I also try to come at it from the angle of like, I want to write smart characters. Like I want everybody to be very smart and very good at what they do, because I just find that provides the best like turning points for a story. When you bring together these extremely intelligent people who are very capable in whatever their domain is, whether it's good guy or bad guy. To me, that just presents like the most compelling reading in a finished product.
Yeah. And I think this is a good point where Ian helps out a lot by saying this guy is no dummy. He wouldn't just go directly to this point if he didn't have to, and you
right.
help like cement that intelligence of the antagonist. You do that well with that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So when you are doing these things and you're trying to balance out these smart characters, you also have to have flaws, and you
sure.
The call signs almost kind of give you an idea what the flaw of the person is, right?
Yep. Yeah. And the flaws are very easy to write. That's one of the things that there's nothing wrong with it, but your standard, I think a lot of thrillers in general, especially military thrillers, you get the guy who's, a black belt in 3 martial arts. He's so good and wholesome and caring and a family man. and he has no flaws, and he was first in his class in everything he did. And you have the whole cast of characters just driving home how awesome this guy is. And that's how they provide the foundation for this guy to be able to do, violent acts and everything else over the course of the mission. And that's always kind of been a pet peeve of mine. Like, there's plenty of books by people who sell a lot more copies than I do, where I can't identify with that. So I like to give guys like the dark side, and particularly the hero, David Rivers, where he's like pretty deeply flawed. And like when his family becomes involved, he flies off the handle, and he, goes off the reservation with his command. And I just find that a lot more compelling. Like, I can't write something that I would be bored to read. I like to write the book that I would want to read and engineer it to that. And readers can take it or leave it. I'm not saying my stuff is better or worse than anybody else's. And I've been fortunate to find an audience that likes to read the same type of stories that I like to write.
Yeah. Having that flawed character and that not perfect character, because it turns out that person who's been perfect all the time, they've probably got a DUI, might have come home with a wife. Like, there's always something,
Yeah.
No one stays perfect for long doing the kind of work that we did. It just doesn't happen that way. Why does David still do it?
Oh man, I think this comes back to the conversation about, if you're a dirt farmer in some third world country and you can pick up an AK-47 and run to the sound of guns, do you do it or not? I think for him and the guys in the team, as I have it written, there's less of a sense of nationalistic duty to their country. None of my characters ever like wrap themselves in an American flag. It's very much like for the love of the profession, right? These guys who like to continually go back into combat situations in a brotherhood of people, and that's on both sides, the good guys and the bad guys in my books. And that's what I found. Part of that's a reflection of like the guys I met in the military, post right after 9/11, obviously you've got that whole nationalistic fervor angle, but once guys are into their third, fourth deployment, have buried a few good friends, that all kind of goes away. And then when, you're Afghanistan 2015, still going back, it just becomes, about the guys you're with and the job you're doing. And I think that experience of the way I perceive a lot of the guys that I worked with has kind of trickled into my writing, where they keep doing it, and David Rivers in particular, because there's nothing else to do. And I occasionally write, scenes in this book as well, where David Rivers is at home and he's, talking about like just the monotony of like normal life in white suburbia with, the non-offensive conversation at dinner parties with his wife's friends, and feeling out of place back in the States, and then going back to combat and feeling like everything is very linear, everything makes sense. And that's really where he shines. And I reflect on some of the dialogue with him and his wife, where it's like, this guy doesn't understand. Like, he's new at being married. He doesn't get how this works. And he's learning how to compartmentalize these two different sides of his life.
That I think you're nailing down here with this balance that we all have to have, that guys like us that have been overseas a lot, especially outside of the wire, where your life is on the line all the time. And then you come back and someone says some blowhardy, stupid thing about combat and politics, or, foreign policy. And you're just like, too much to bite your tongue, but you have to bite your tongue because no one wants to hear it,
Yeah. In a lot of cases, people don't want to hear like the details. I mean, anybody who's deployed has probably come back and done with their buddies back home, and people want to ask questions. And then if you start telling things like they are, people shut up real quick. And I've heard this from a lot of people, and I've certainly had the experience where a lot of times people don't want they don't want the truth. They want to know like this, my son, brother, husband, whatever, like went to war, serving honorably in the military, and everything's going to be fine. A lot of times they don't want to hear those. They don't want to hear how things are on the ground, and honestly, nor really should they. And there's also, I'm sure you've had like where you meet the guys who are like, oh yeah, you're in the military, what'd you do? And you're like, oh, I was like, yeah, I was gonna join, but I met my girlfriend, told me not to, my mom talked me out of it. Like I meet a lot of people like that, where they almost like cut you off to explain like why they didn't join. It's okay, it's a volunteer military, man. You don't have to like justify it.
All right. I'm glad you didn't go. Well, the other thing is that we often say is like, I would rather be there. I'd rather be getting shot at than have to go through this. And this can be the most mundane thing ever. Like we just, we struggle to find something that means enough to us compared to living your life in that fashion.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of the veteran success stories you see are the guys who get out of the military and have like a single mission that they drive themselves into, like, be it starting a business or getting behind a charity or whatever, where it's some meaningful connection to them. And those guys who kind of hit the ground running are the guys that you see really succeeding and helping out a lot of people and everything. I think it'd be difficult for, guys who come from that environment, get out and don't have some driving purpose of trying to find a job, and you're not really meeting anybody that, are like the guys you used to work with. And it's just so far removed from that experience. It can be tough.
Yeah, and then I know from my own experience, you come back and I was highly influential with my command because I'm an excellent intel guy, and so I was driving a lot of how the battalion and brigade saw and did things, or if I was working with a bunch of ODAs, like it would be invaluable. And then I come back and I'm like, hey, I'm valuable. I can do things. I can help someone. Look at this job here. I can crush this job. And then you don't even get a response. You're just like, Jesus, all right, I'll go get shot at. Like that's where the money is. That's what I get paid to do. But it's funny because someone once told me, and again, I'm a spy. I can go out, I can do a lot of things. I can sell things, I can market things, whatever it is. When someone told me that I could maybe get a job guarding things because I was in the military, and I'm like, didn't you just hear me say that I was a spy and can go into town and find things out that no one else can find out? Isn't that valuable at all? And they're like, we don't understand how to apply that to home. And it turns guys like David into guys that, like, if you're going to work in the contract world anyhow, that's the job you want, right? Like this black operation job going overseas, saying that you're trained in, I don't know, Jordanians or whatever it is, rather than, sitting at NTC doing role playing.
Yeah. And it's funny that the resumes don't always translate. A buddy of mine got out, he came out of Ranger Regiment, started the company, he's in the geo in space. And he was telling me, he's like, civilians don't understand how to read like military experience. And one of the guys he picked up, he was like looking through job applications. There's this guy who'd been floating around like looking for jobs. And it was like Intel analyst at DevGru, and nobody knew what that meant. So he was like a SEAL Team 6 Intel analyst.
Yeah.
And he scooped this guy up and cut him loose. And he's just been, obviously doing amazing work, right? Because you don't act in an Intel capacity or any other capacity at that tier 1 level without being extremely good at your job. But yeah, there were civilian companies passing up on this guy for all his experience.
Yeah. And it's like, well, what did you guys do? Well, like the Google thing where it translates your MOS into jobs. You type in 97 Bravo. It's like, there's cook jobs at the Sheraton. Come on. Here's the reality that we have to deal with at some point, and I'm sure you must do this in your books, is if you deploy enough times, you've definitely killed the wrong person. You've gathered intel on the wrong person. Someone has said, we need to find someone to kill. We've killed the wrong person in some way, somehow. It just happens. Even if it's an innocent person who you encounter, and by your encounter, you cause that person's life to be significantly worse than it was before. You just can't help it. It's just an outcome of being there. How do your guys deal with that? And I don't mean in real life, but in the books.
In the books, I do put in some of that humanizing angle, particularly in the second book, the follow-up for the book you read. I go a bit deeper into that, but yeah, it's tough, that level of collateral damage, which is inevitable. And a lot of it that I experienced with civilians getting, killed, horribly maimed, was due to like enemy indiscriminate gunfire, but it's because like we were there, we were doing a target. I've had to call in medevacs where we're loading our host nation force wounded along with civilians who got, chopped up by a grenade blast or whatever. And I've also seen that, that level of carnage, including like women and children where, they go over an IED that was meant for you. And it's tough, but like you said, it does happen. Like that happens in any war. There's no way around it. And I try to make my characters very cognizant of that, right? It's not something that happens in a one-line write-off. It's something where there's these deeply human characters. And in the opening scene of the book you read, where there's that little girl who's caught in the crossfire, and a guy goes out of his way, a guy with few redeeming moral characteristics, right? Which is the hero of the story. Goes out of his way to save her because he couldn't live, he's got a daughter at home and he couldn't live with knowing that she got killed. I try to put in those humanizing moments, and then have have it where it comes to bear, where they come into situations with the civilians who are like very much like not grateful for it. Where he's like, oh yeah, I saved your daughter. Like, you started a gunfight in my village that put her in danger in the first place, right? So there's not this, this kind of element of hubris. People like, oh, America, hooray! Like, they're very, with the civilian populace in my books, is very aware that like this team has brought bad things into their area. I think you're on mute.
I am so off my game today.
No word.
That villager who doesn't have a physical quarrel with you, but is absolutely like, fuck you. I hate you. You're America. I hate that guy, but I hate you too. So don't leave me the fuck alone. Because I've met that guy. And you're left with that guy or somebody else. And you're like, let me at least try to work on this one person. But you don't always have time for that in the book. But that is the reality, is that we are sorting through people who aren't binary. They're not yes or no. They're complex. And you don't have a lot of time. And you're great at compressing time in this book, where like operations move at a pace that you can't. Let me see if I can say this right. Operators who are on the ground want to move at the pace that they need to move at, because they're dealing with the ground truth. When you've got to get on the sat phone and say, mommy, can I drop a JDAM or whatever it is, that you're getting further behind the timeline. But you also have people run amok, in a faraway sovereign land, dropping JDAMs or breaking international law or US law to do that.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about that. How do you balance that out, that timeline and that crunch, and then, dealing with how plausible is a Black Op program like that? You're like, is this too much of a leap for my audience to make?
Sure. So in terms of the fictional program, so CIA targeted killing program, a lot of what I based this off of was, it was 2008. The media became aware that the CIA director at the time was Leon Panetta. He had just shut down a program which had been in the startup phase. It was pretty much a series of briefings where it was a proposal for a targeted killing program that had bypassed all Senate oversight and was kind of rising for different levels of approval. And that was to send in CIA ground branch, like paramilitary officers, to go conduct targeted killings. People don't say assassination, but same difference, with a no borders charter. And then Leon Panetta found out about it, wisely, immediately shut it down, informed congressional oversight and everything. So that news story, like, I remember when that broke, and it kind of stuck with me. So when I started this series, I kind of started with that premise, and I talked to a guy who, like yourself, has done a lot of different stuff in the Intel committee. And he advised me, he was like, yeah, if you were this is in the early plotting phases. I was like, how would something like this work? Not in Hollywood, like real world. He's like, minimum level of oversight would be, top Republican Democrat in the House Intelligence Committee, and then the Senate, same with the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And then the chairman for the SSCI would have great oversight to it. And then it would be like the top CIA leadership, like minimum these 6 people, right? And that's what it translated to in the book. And it was really fun working with that element where, you do have a senator, and I've taken a 1-star review on this. I'm like, that's not how it works. And I don't know what his background was, but the guy I talked to, I trust deeply. And he was like, yes, like the senator in charge of the program could insert himself on the top floor to oversee this operation, to make himself a nuisance, and bring down that pressure from oversight. And that was one of the things that's really fun to play around with in this book is, the dueling perspectives, right, of the CIA handler who's tasked with running this program, was a former station chief, female character, with a great amount of experience in the agency. And then that ground force commander who's kind of this grizzled former military dude, just wants to get things done. And then playing those two off each other in terms of they both need their own approvals. Each withholds or provides information to the other in a ploy to get what they want. Both have the same end goal of stopping people who would do their country harm. But due to the different levels of oversight for her and then the ground truth for him, becomes a really fun battle of wits for everybody to keep advancing the ball however they can, sometimes in opposition to each other.
Yeah, and the balance between, if I do this and it doesn't work out, I'm going to jail.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And maybe if it works out and I still go to jail, it's kind of like that coach. It's like, don't shoot. Great shot.
Yeah.
But that is, I mean, that's that time that you play with and everything. You know, you do a great job of creating that tension. Do we ever get to see more of your antagonist from their point of view in some of these books? You said, I know you go more depth, but like, you know, their own version of these realities, you know, like I have to push because the Americans are smart. I know that they have drones. They're probably overhead right now. I can't see them or hear them, but I know they're there. So we have to act this way. Like, do they have that operational intelligence that you're able to display in a book, or is that not something that you try to bring forward in your stories?
It's story dependent, right? So this book, The Enemies of My Country, is heavily focused on the family element, right? The second book, Last Target Standing, without giving away any spoilers, there's a lot more villain POV down to the exact justification for how and why they're doing everything they're doing, and how they're reacting to the forces, the governmental forces that are opposing them. But it's going to vary by book and by storyline. So some books are going to have, I'll be able to delve more into that POV due to the fact that the plot allows it, and I can ratchet up the tension by inserting that. For this one, because I went so heavily into that family angle, I had written a lot more from the enemy's POV that my editor was like, this is just, it's a tension release valve. Like you're letting steam out of the pressure cooker when we want to ramp it up. So I did end up trimming some of his perspective. And in the end, it comes down to the individual story, and whatever serves that finished product best from the reader perspective is what I do.
When you are writing gunfight scenes, it's hard to be in a gunfight and know what's going on, as you well know. Like they shoot at us, and I remember the first time I was in the gunfight and time slowed down to the point where it was like, okay, and let me just say this for the audience: when you're in a firefight, time is weird. You might be shooting and think it was 2 hours, look down, 8 minutes, just because time is really elastic in a gunfight. They're not always the same way. At least that's my experience. But when these guys are in this, you have to, I don't know how much you can write that, and if that's too much detail, but also just the chaos of where everybody's at, and then allowing us to mentally map, like, okay, Jeff is over by the building, by the saloon, and you're like trying to describe something that's really hard to describe. Keep it moving forward. Talk about that, please.
Yeah. So how I balanced it with this book, really came down to like a structural decision for how I wanted to map out the series. And I wanted to do like really in-depth tactical scenarios. So the way I chose to skin that cat for this series, including the book you read, was to have the team of 5 guys on the ground and then jump points of view from one guy to the next, right? So at no point is there an omnipotent narrator who sees everything that's going on, but you see, the perspective of one guy from where he's at in the fight, what he's thinking, how he's reacting, and then it'll flip to another guy at a separate point in the fight. And I like to paint the holistic picture that way through a series of, individual points of view where these guys are tunnel focused on what is in front of them and what they're reacting to in that second. And then by hopscotching those POVs, I find it allows me personally to kind of paint these more in-depth tactical scenarios that I would be able to do with a single character point of view.
Yeah, you did it really well. I mean, I thought it was really genuine, because there is also an elasticity, or there's a balancing, I guess I would say, of like a gunfight. So if 2 guys are engaged and they're trying to bound forward or move towards cover or whatever it is they're trying to do, there's someone else who's not being engaged and they're trying to run towards the engagement in a way that, either draws attention or flanks something. It's incredible that teams become so, I don't want to say, they're so well trained that they know how to flex in and then not kill each other for the most part. I mean, a gunfight is a chaotic place. You can definitely shoot the wrong person easily, but you hear things, like you hear the weapon, you're like, that's us, that's probably Chris over there. And it's incredible when you write that, because I thought about that. When you were writing, there's a gunfight later in the book, big surprise.
Spoiler.
Yeah, spoiler. There's going to be some gunfights, but I'm like, this doesn't remind me of a specific thing, but just the way you kind of drew the whole thing out. I'm like, this does feel like how this would feel, and And even if you're not like a prime shooter like Ian has a job in there, and he's doing his best to find his role in there and try to apply pressure to relieve pressure. And it's a team.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's really fun to write. Just the second book is fresh in my mind because I just finished it. But yeah, like those little details of like the guy who's approaching a partisan link up and like, activates his infrared laser, like so his team knows what he can see and what he can't, because the partisan link up driver stopped past the grid, so he has to approach from a different angle. He can't see this, and he's like thinking in his head, like activating his laser so that everybody in these overwatch positions immediately knows, like, okay, he can't see the bed, so if armed guys start piling out, he's not going to be able to react quick enough. And yeah, I like injecting those elements of knowing what your teammates are thinking and how they're going to react. It's really fun with a tight cast of 5 guys like that. It's just limitless potential for jumping around the different points of view and opinions, and then also delving into like them ridiculing each other. Like, why is this idiot doing that? Like, you see what the guy's thinking when he does it, and then you see another character's perception of it, and then in the end when they're hashing it out with like bets of who owes who cases of beer, after a gunfight's over, it's just a blast. Yeah, I love my job.
Yeah. No, that's a lot of fun too. One of the things I always think about, because oftentimes I'm off the camp, and I'm being careful when I do this. I'm not just willy-nilly walking off the camp, but I'm with somebody, and I think if something happens right now, okay, there's a thing called the running password, and this is for the audience, and maybe it's Yankee, and so you're running going Yankee, 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 so that nobody shoots you. They still may shoot you because you are running towards the camp, and you're running because you're trying to get away from something crazy. But these are the things where like you're hoping that everybody else understands the message that you're sending, whether it's a beam of light that you can only see through night vision goggles, or some kind of message where you're trying to get someone's attention. It is a loud place in a gunfight. It's loud, and sometimes this is the thing that always struck me too. You must have examples of this where, like, again, time slows down. Like, you can be getting shot at and there can be a funny moment. You're like, I have to remember that for later on and tell that story. Or like you look down and you see a flower and you're like hyper focused on the flower. You're like, why am I looking at this fucking flower? Let me get back to this gun. All these little things where your brain, you can be totally focused, but because combat has slowed down, there's other things that you can start to see. And it's really interesting when you go back and you can replay this very clear memory in your mind of what happened, all of the things that are kind of stored in your mental hard drive.
Yeah, the elasticity of time is funny because sometimes it's all very, very linear and not confusing, and there's other times where I've had after an engagement is over and then you're getting together with whatever your second command NCO is, being like, how long were we shooting for? Like, was that 2 hours? Was that 45 minutes? Okay, well, I sent this message on Blue Force Tracker at this time. You're trying to like piece together like what happened. But meantime, in the middle of it, everybody's reacting and everybody's kind of doing their thing in the flow. And then afterwards, trying to dissect it for like, an after action review or, your reporting procedures. It becomes like almost a collective narrative. Like, what did you see? What was going on here? It's a really chaotic and, like you said, often absurd environment that I love representing in fiction.
Yeah, it's great. And the other element that you did really well is, okay, so in the movies, there's an unlimited supply, weapons are, invincible and everything else. But in reality, some cast off AK-47. I mean, look, I've shot AK-47s. I'm terrified to shoot those things because you don't know, like, if it's like, why did the guy throw it down? Did it jam? Is it going to explode in my face? I've got to pick this thing up and shoot it. And the other thing I always like to talk about is, like, you can be on a small team and you can have a double load of ammo, right? And so you've got to find that number of rounds. It might feel like a lot, but once you start shooting, all of a sudden you're like, man, I'm going to run out of ammo soon if I keep shooting at things. But we keep having things to shoot at. And you do a great job of dealing with that because you don't have 10,000 rounds on a pallet somewhere just waiting for you to reload. And if you did have to reload, goodness gracious, how long is that going to take? So you really have what you have. And if you bite off too much of a fight, you can be in life and death trouble really fast. Whether you're a better fighter or not, you're just going to run out of supplies and ability to provision. It's not about how bad you are. It's about how well you can provision that and conserve that ability to be lethal.
Sure. And then, one of the ways the team deals with it in the book is like the battlefield resupply element, right? Small team behind enemy lines, like no support. and suddenly thrown out of their league where it's like, hey, these people can't get here quick enough, like start movement now. So it becomes very much like every firefight, I always write it like they are scooping up weapons and ammo off enemy bodies and saving it for a rainy day, even if they have some remaining. And then also it's just great writing that later when you have to resort to. And in the second book, I did this as well, like where it's a little bit heavier on that angle. Like now we're relying on this weapon where it's a Chinese unlicensed derivative of a Soviet Kalashnikov weapon, and I have no idea how it's going to shoot. There's ammo. Yeah.
It is one of the realities, like you pick up, like I've never shot a 7mm pistol before, but this is the weapon that I now have to shoot because I've got 10 extra rounds here. It's neat. When you write a story, the stuff that doesn't make the cut, do you save that and try to bring it in later on in some other aspect?
I don't anymore. I used to be very, when you start out writing, or for me, I was like, everything's precious and I don't know if the ideas are going to come back. So I used to save everything. And I just found that every time I tried to like retrofit something or see if it could fit, it never ever worked. And I always ended up chopping it. So now I kind of erase that stuff with confidence. And then every time I start a book, it's like this big daunting thing. And how's it going? And I'm going through this now with the third book in that series. It's always this great unknown. You're always like, oh man, maybe he'll pull it off. And then you start plotting, you start throwing your brain against the wall with it. And then you just hit that point where suddenly you hear the characters talking. And that's my cue for like, hit the keyboard and start writing it. And then every time it kind of fills itself in. But the best work I do is writing like scene by scene. Like the best pieces of writing, in my opinion, that I've made were just, none of it came from a previous book. None of it came from an idea for the next book. It's just like when you're sitting down each day and throwing yourself back in mentally with that team on the ground. So yeah, now I do everything organic to each book, and I just chop whatever I don't use.
Would it surprise you to find out how close to reality you are? Like if you're closer than, because obviously there's a lot of fantasy in what you're writing, but the reality is that the government often doesn't have the capacity it needs to do a job. The border crisis right now is a great example. You don't need 5,000 extra permanent border agents. You need to flex in some contract capacity to get through this surge and process it and everything else. And that can mean a lot of gray area with the rules. So, we know this happens. And so if there are teams out there that are doing things to augment, a Delta team can't be everywhere. It just can't. Dev group can't do everything. And so, would it surprise you to find out how close you are? Like if something like this happens, if that team, something bad happens and they all die in the desert somewhere, and you're like, oh my God, this was a contract assassin squad or whatever they get called in the papers. Would that surprise you at all?
Yeah, I'd be shocked if anything I wrote was accurate to reality. Like, like I said, I try to do that bedrock of authenticity where I talk to guys who have done jobs like that when I'm plotting, to make sure I'm not going too far off the reservation in terms of like, it's one of the guys that consults heavily with me on it. He'll be like, this doesn't pass the giggle test, or this was good. And when I sent him the draft of that book, I expected him to decimate all my, all the scenes in the CIA Operations Center, all the stuff with the senators providing oversight. And he didn't touch much of it. He was like, tweak this, tweak that. This is how this would actually work. But for the most part, it was intact. And I think in large part, that's due to like, my guess is as good as anybody's. And I got to hear a lecture by Stephen Pressfield, who wrote, Gates of Fire, among many, many other fine books. But he received all this historian anger about how he wrote, the Spartan phalanx and all these different techniques. And when he was talking to the group of readers that I was in listening to him, he was like, he's like, nobody knows exactly how this worked. My guess is as good as anybody's. I'm looking at this, the technology they had. This is what history had to say about it. And then where it becomes guesswork, I write it the best I can. And, my guess is as good as theirs. So yeah, I don't think, and I certainly don't claim that I'm like nailing this authenticity for stuff. I've never worked in the CIA. I've never worked in DC. And even the stuff I write on the ground in gunfights is completely fictional. So I would be much more surprised if anything I wrote was accurate from that perspective. I think the most important thing is to create like an authentic story world, like the rules within this world, right? So we were talking about like magazines don't last forever. Like you run out of ammo, guys get shot, things go wrong. And I think as long as you set in whatever genre, whether you're fantasy or sci-fi, or military thriller. I think just establishing that authentic world where things happen by a set of rules within that reality you've created as an author. That's the most important thing for me, and I think that's what most readers value.
Yeah, I can see that. I wanted to make sure Stephen Pressfield, Gates of Fire, great book. Also, he's got special operations in there. They're damn near in the fight before it, Gilead gets crazy by crawling in and infiltrating.
Yeah.
Of course, that's always existed, right? Like, who's crazy enough to go in that camp and try to kill the king? There's going to be dumb.
Yep.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And then I guess my author question for you is this: you've done it. You've cracked the code on how to, like, you're less worried. You're always trying to sell books, of course, but you're less worried about that now and more about production, which is a big hurdle for authors. You're not just like, I'm self-published first book. You're well into this now, and you have an audience. What do you do to grow that audience and manage it? Like, give them more of what they want. How do you not overfeed it? I mean, how do you pace your work-life balance? All this stuff is always fascinating to me, how every author deals with it.
Sure. So to start with the production piece, I started out as an independent author. It's called independent author when you just hit publish on your own stuff on Amazon. It's really, you're an independent publisher, right? Because whether you're an indie or a big traditionally published author, like, nobody gets a shortcut and the story magically comes to you, right? Like, we're all going through the same process, but the difference is on the indie side, you have to produce constantly because you don't have no placement at Barnes and Noble. You have no, multi-million-dollar marketing team, which the trad guys work every bit as hard as the most hardworking indie. I'm not trying to draw a delineation there, but they own the sales corridors, right? They own these pipelines to get everything into bookstores and get the mass media behind their books and line up all these interviews and book signings. And as an indie, you don't have that. So indies have to write a lot faster typically. So most of the independent authors that I know, and myself when I was doing it, the concept of writing a book a year is like death. Like, you better be keeping a day job and doing this as a side hustle, because you'll never turn a profit. You're reaching a much smaller audience. And then now that I did sign with a publisher in August 2020, just so I could focus on writing full time, which has been great, but I can't slow down that rate of production. And if I tried to, I would just be a basket case. My wife would be like, go back to your office. Like, this is terrible. Because at some point you're constantly involved in the story, and you have to keep producing. So I do produce at a higher rate that's more in line with what independent authors do. And then in terms of growing the audience, I kind of find my audience by accident. You're relying on people stumbling across your book on Amazon, which is very little organic visibility. Mainly it comes down to advertising, Amazon ads. That's how everybody finds you. And if you don't play that game, you're not going to get any exposure. So finding those readers initially is largely a facet of advertising, right? So everybody listening to this podcast who's ever bought a book on Kindle, like, you probably didn't know that whatever you were searching for, everything you're seeing is basically like, look for that little line of sponsored text and that somebody paying to show up, usually under their own name, just to stay in the fight. And then once I get those readers, I try to keep them and keep re-engaging them. So every book, I have like, sign up for my mailing list at this website. You'll get like this free short story, this free novella that are prequel stories for two of my mainline series. And then I have a 2-month long onboarding process where there's automated emails, introducing myself, my background, what my books are about, to keep re-engaging these readers. And when somebody hits reply and like tells me what they're reading or what they thought of the books, like, I answer every single email, which is a considerable, investment of time. And it's not a hardship because, one, it keeps you grounded with your readership and what they like, what they don't like. And two, I remember having no readers at all. And it's terrifying, like getting out, having no income, like, okay, I sold 5 books today. I sold 5 ebooks and it's a big day. Like, I remember being there. So I'm extremely grateful for all these readers. And I after they're onboarded in my mailing list, I send out updates about once a month. It's not just books, like what's going on in my family. And I treat my readers almost like family. Like my wife, we just had a child. When she got pregnant, I was like, hey, when can I announce to my readers that you're pregnant? She's like, pump the brakes, let's give it a few weeks. And I kept like asking her because it felt like I was holding something back from my family, because those are the people that, they support you. They're the only reason you can keep doing this. And I would be, I don't know, selling insurance. I have no idea what I would be doing if this had all fallen through, which it very nearly did in the beginning. And then I also do like, I have a Facebook readers group that I'm on that, we talk about books, family, whatever. And it becomes this really cool like atmosphere where you kind of set the tone like, hey, no politics, no book spoilers. That's it. And then, I talk to people about, bourbon recommendations and what I'm working on now, or when I finish a rough draft of manuscript, like, it's just a constant touch point of being connected with the readers. And that's honestly, it's one of the best parts of the job, because it can be so much of a grind sometimes. It's, you lock yourself in a room. It's it's not a recipe for mental health in large part. You lock yourself in a room. There's days when I go to pick up my daughter and I like step out in the afternoon sunlight. It's like Gollum, crawling out from under a rock. I'm like, oh, wow, it's warm today. I can wear t-shirts again. And you have no idea because you're in a room all day. And then just the constant cycle of 1-star reviews, like trying to stay on top of book sales and everything. And the support network are those readers. And that's one of the things where I really like go to refill my cup, is like just going to engage with readers, hear what they thought about the last book, where they hope it's going for the series. And that kind of keeps you like, that personally for me, that keeps me like my morale up, spirits high, and getting back up every morning and going back to the keyboard.
How many hours a day are you writing? Like on a common day?
Generally it's 4 to 6.
Okay.
And I log it all. So that's a pretty specific, that's like time at the keyboard. If I stop writing, I like stop the clock to track my word count. Generally around 4 hours can be the point of diminishing returns. I try to hit my 3,000 words a day. By that point, some days I'm like on fire. I get a second one in the afternoon. I go another couple hours, but I try not to force it, because you just hit a point where you go from the highway to the gravel road, and it just becomes like, just hit pause. It's going to be there tomorrow. And that's what keeps, for me, my writing the freshest. My best work comes from like hitting it again every day, diving into it, and just sensing that point of like, all right, you're not like, just go get a drink. Like, you're done, shut it down for the day.
Yeah. Train, don't overtrain. I love it. Well, listen, everybody, the link is up on the site here. If you're on the podcast side, it'll be in the show notes. And then, of course, Enemies of My Country, The Shadow Strike. It's the first book in the series. That link is also going across on the scroller. And again, that will be in the show notes as well. If you like these kinds of books, I mean, I read it. I'm a combat guy. I can tell you right now, it's fantastic. If you like these kind of stories, it is fun. It's a movie in your head. And I really appreciate, Jason. I appreciate you coming on and talking about this. I know I gave you a lot of, esoteric questions, but I think that's what people, love about the show, is that we're able to talk more about, the you in the book and the things that it takes for you to get that book out. And I appreciate you doing it.
No, thanks so much for having me, Pete. It's been a blast.